Welcome. I'm Rusty, a private investigator. Join me on Truth in Shadows as we embark on a journey to uncover the truth together. Let's dive into the mysterious and expose the hidden realities. 25 years of silence. The shocking truth behind Kim Langwell's disappearance. Introduction to Kim Langwell. Kim Langwell was born on December 24, 1965, in Houston, Texas. From a young age, she demonstrated resilience and a strong will to succeed. As a child, she was known for her determination and the love she had for her family. She grew up with her parents and sister in a close-knit community, always doing her best to help others and keep those around her happy. However, life wasn't always easy for Kim. At 18, she became a mother to her daughter Tiffany. Soon after Tiffany was born, the father left, leaving Kim to raise her child alone. Kim, however, was not one to let adversity define her. She worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, always focused on providing a better life for her daughter. Despite the financial struggles, she was determined to give Tiffany a life full of opportunities and happiness. After several years of living in Houston, Kim decided to start fresh. She moved to Beaumont, Texas, where she hoped to find a new beginning and build a stable life for herself and Tiffany. At first, life in Beaumont was difficult. Kim juggled 3 different jobs to pay the bills and support Tiffany. Yet, she kept pushing forward, knowing that this was the sacrifice she had to make to secure a better future. Eventually, her hard work paid off when she secured a job at a local oil refinery. This job allowed her to spend more time with Tiffany, and it was here that Kim met Ken Weatherford, a kind and attentive man who would eventually become her boyfriend. Kim and Ken began dating, and the relationship quickly blossomed. Ken was supportive and cared deeply for Kim and Tiffany. Soon, they started making plans for their future together. However, despite the budding relationship with Ken, there was still a shadow from Kim's past, Terry Rose, her ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had been turbulent and ultimately ended due to Terry's controlling and violent behavior. The fateful evening, July 9, 1999, began like any other day for Kim Langwell. She had spent the day working her shift at the oil refinery, and that evening, she was looking forward to spending time with her daughter and Ken. Kim had planned to finish work around 5 p.m., head home, and then go out for dinner with Tiffany and Ken. She called Tiffany at 5:15 p.m. to confirm the plans, letting her know that she had a few errands to run before heading home and might be a little late. Tiffany didn't think much of it. After all, her mother had always been busy but reliable. By 6:30 p.m., Ken arrived at Kim's house, excited to meet up with her for dinner. But when he arrived, Kim was nowhere to be found. He tried calling her, but Kim didn't answer the phone, which was unusual for her. She was always in touch with either Ken or Tiffany, especially when it came to plans they had made. As the hours passed and Kim still didn't show up, Ken became increasingly worried. Around 10 p.m., unable to reach her, Ken decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove along the route Kim would have taken from work to home, stopping at local stores and other places she might have been. But there was no sign of Kim anywhere. His anxiety grew with each passing minute. It wasn't like Kim to disappear without letting anyone know where she was. Ken continued searching the area, and after driving around for a while, he eventually spotted Kim's car, a 1994 Nissan Altima, parked outside an Eckerd pharmacy at the corner of Dowland and Phelan Streets in Beaumont. The car was sitting idle in the parking lot, but Kim was nowhere to be found. Ken approached the car and looked inside. Her purse, cell phone, and personal items were in the vehicle, but there was no sign of Kim. She had vanished. At first, Ken tried to convince himself that she had just decided to leave her car there and go somewhere else. Perhaps she had changed her mind about dinner, or maybe she had gone to meet a friend. Despite his best efforts to rationalize the situation, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. He returned home, hoping Kim would turn up by morning. The next morning, Ken drove back to the pharmacy. To his growing horror, the car was still there, but Kim was still missing. Kim had not come home overnight, and she hadn't called anyone to explain her absence. The weight of the situation hit Ken hard. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something terrible had happened to Kim. He immediately called the police. The discovery of the car. The police arrived at the scene shortly after Ken called them. They began their investigation by examining Kim's car. While there were no signs of a struggle inside, the discovery of her cell phone was troubling. It was unusual for Kim to leave her phone behind. especially since it was such an essential part of her daily life. The investigators also spoke to Tiffany, who had been the last person to speak with Kim before her disappearance. Tiffany explained that after work, Kim had planned to stop by the house of a man named Terry Rose, her ex-boyfriend. Kim had been involved with Terry for several years before their relationship ended badly. Despite breaking up with him over 6 months ago, they had remained in contact. On the evening of her disappearance, Terry had asked Kim to come by and help him with a small repair project, holding some shelves while he mounted them to the wall. Tiffany told the police that she had called Terry later that evening to check in and confirm that Kim had made it to his house. Terry told Tiffany that Kim had stopped by briefly, but left soon after. This was the last piece of information Tiffany had about her mother's whereabouts. However, as the investigation unfolded, a darker story emerged. Terry had been aggressive and controlling during his relationship with Kim. His behavior became more erratic over time, and Kim had confided in her friends that she feared for her safety. At one point, she even told them that if she ever disappeared, they should start looking for her in Terry's backyard. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the police started to focus their attention on Terry as a prime suspect. But despite their growing suspicions, Terry denied any involvement in Kim's disappearance. He claimed that Kim had only stopped by for a short time to help him with the shelves, and that he had nothing to do with her vanishing. His alibi, however, was vague and unsubstantiated. Investigators soon realized that they had very little to go on, and the case started to stall. The investigation begins. The morning after Kim Langwell's disappearance, Ken Weatherford's call to the Beaumont Police Department set the investigation in motion. The police quickly focused on the two most significant people in Kim's life: her ex-boyfriend, Terry Rose, and her boss, Frank. Terry Rose's involvement in Kim's life was a source of growing suspicion. His relationship with Kim had been troubled from the beginning, marked by possessiveness, emotional abuse, and even physical violence. Despite breaking up with him over 6 months prior to her disappearance, Kim had remained in contact with Terry, likely out of fear for her safety. Friends of Kim reported that, months before her disappearance, Terry had choked her during an argument, and Kim had confided in them that if anything happened to her, they should search his property. These chilling words now took on a heavy, unsettling significance. When the police questioned Terry, his story was inconsistent. He claimed that Kim had only stopped by his house for a few minutes to help him put up some shelves, but he had no alibi for the time she went missing. His story lacked any substantial evidence, and his behavior seemed off. Despite Kim's family and friends openly suspecting him, Terry's indifference toward her disappearance was unsettling. When Kim's sister confronted him, Terry seemed almost callous, showing no real concern for her fate. He continued to deny any involvement, even as his actions seemed increasingly suspicious. The police, however, were unable to immediately link Terry to Kim's disappearance. They searched his property thoroughly, but found no trace of Kim. There were no signs of a struggle, no personal items left behind, no blood, just the eerie silence of a man who seemed to be hiding something. As the days passed, Terry's behavior continued to raise eyebrows. He seemed to mock the search efforts, acting more like a man who had already won rather than someone whose life was in the balance. With no solid evidence linking Terry to the crime, the police were forced to continue searching for other clues. Yet, as time wore on, it became evident that Kim's disappearance was more than just a random vanishing. Someone close to her had been involved, and the truth was hiding just beneath the surface. The link to Frank. As the investigation deepened, another troubling figure emerged: Kim's boss, Frank. From the very beginning of Kim's employment at the refinery, Frank had made her uncomfortable. He showered her with love letters, over 100 in total, which Kim had kept hidden, fearing retaliation at work. Frank, a married man, became obsessed with Kim. He would often drive by her house, even parking across the street to watch her. Kim confided in her friends that Frank had begun to harass her, and she feared his advances might escalate into something more dangerous. Kim was visibly uncomfortable around Frank, yet she felt trapped. She feared that if she rejected him completely, he might cause trouble at work or worse, reveal her secret relationship with him to his wife. Kim had spoken openly to her friends about Frank's obsession, making it clear that if something ever happened to her, they should investigate Frank as a potential suspect. Those ominous warnings were now playing out in the worst possible way. When the police confronted Frank, his response was perplexing. He downplayed any feelings for Kim, claiming that it had been a passing crush and insisting that he had never pursued her aggressively. However, his love letters told a very different story. Letters filled with longing, passion, and a clear desire for more than just a professional relationship. Frank's denial of any wrongdoing seemed like a facade, especially when police discovered that Frank had no alibi for the evening Kim went missing. He had a receipt showing he had been at a store around 6:56 p.m., but there was an hour-long window during which Kim could have been abducted, time that Frank could not account for. Despite this, the police were unable to pin Frank down. His alibi was flimsy, but without any concrete proof linking him to Kim's disappearance, they were forced to let him go. Still, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that Frank knew more than he was letting on. His obsession with Kim and his strange behavior following her disappearance seemed too much to ignore. The police, though, had hit another dead end. Terry remained the primary suspect, but with no evidence to support their claims, the case went cold. It seemed as though Kim's fate would remain a mystery forever. The search for more clues. Months turned into years, and the investigation grew colder. Despite the exhaustive efforts of the Beaumont Police Department, no new evidence surfaced. Volunteer search parties scoured the city and its outskirts, hoping for a breakthrough. But every lead turned up empty. The once vibrant investigation had slowed to a crawl, leaving Kim's family and friends with nothing but the tormenting question of what had happened to her. Yet, even in the absence of hard evidence, new developments began to arise. The first came from Kim's family, who had started receiving strange phone calls in the days and weeks after her disappearance. The caller never spoke, only breathing heavily into the phone before hanging up. Kim's family was convinced that Terry was behind these unsettling calls, but once again, the police could not make a connection. This eerie harassment was a constant reminder that someone knew more than they were willing to admit. As the years went by, the lack of answers took its toll. Kim's family never gave up, though. They remained steadfast in their belief that Terry was involved, even as the case remained cold. They would not rest until the truth was revealed. In the meantime, another strange incident occurred. Several years after Kim went missing, Terry approached Tiffany on the street, asking if she had heard anything from her mother. Kim's sister intervened and told Terry to leave. As he walked away, Terry muttered something that would come back to haunt everyone. "Aren't you curious about which polygraph question I failed? It was the one where they asked if I killed Kim." This chilling remark was enough to send a shiver down Tiffany's spine. She immediately contacted the police, but once again, there was no way to tie Terry to Kim's disappearance. The investigators, however, knew they were on the right track. They just needed one final piece of the puzzle. The documentary reopens the case. It had been nearly 25 years since Kim Langwell disappeared, and the case had long gone cold. Despite the efforts of local law enforcement and the tireless work of her family, there had been no breakthroughs. Terry, Rose, and Frank remained at the top of the list of suspects, but there was no evidence to tie them directly to Kim's disappearance. The case had stalled, and it seemed as if the answers would never come. But in early 2024, something unexpected happened. A true crime documentary crew, working on a segment for the Oxygen Network's Cold Justice, decided to reopen the investigation into Kim's case. The crew interviewed Kim's family, friends, and colleagues looking for new leads. As they began digging into the old files, they discovered inconsistencies in the evidence and unanswered questions that the previous investigation had overlooked. The documentary team's involvement gave the case a fresh perspective. They retraced the steps of the investigation and re-interviewed the people involved. Among the most telling discoveries were inconsistencies in Terry's behavior and the contradictions in his statements. In the years following Kim's disappearance, Terry had never shown the expected remorse for his actions. Instead, his behavior grew more suspicious. He had even made bizarre comments to Kim's family, such as his offhand remark about the polygraph test he failed, a comment that now seemed like a slip of the tongue. This new wave of scrutiny was enough to convince prosecutors and investigators to take another look at the case, but the breakthrough they needed was still missing. The team knew they had to get Terry to talk again. Despite his refusal to speak with them, they decided to confront him face to face, hoping that the pressure would break him. Confronting Terry, the crew traveled to Terry's home in Beaumont, Texas. They knew Terry had refused to cooperate with law enforcement, but the documentary team was determined to make him confront his past. As they arrived, they saw Terry through a window, and immediately he fled. He dashed out the back door, trying to escape in his car. The crew wasn't going to let him off that easily. They blocked his path, trapping him in his driveway. It was clear from his actions that Terry was not just avoiding the crew. He was actively trying to escape. When confronted, Terry denied seeing them, but his panicked reaction spoke volumes. The documentary team pressed him, but once again, he insisted that he had no reason to harm Kim. His explanation, that he was never bothered by their breakup, and that Kim's disappearance was an unfortunate event, was convincing only to those willing to accept his word at face value. But the documentary team didn't buy it. They knew that Terry's shifting stories and evasive behavior were enough to warrant further investigation. His refusal to cooperate and his nervous behavior only strengthened their suspicions. As the crew pushed him further, Terry's lies began to unravel. He changed his story yet again, claiming that Kim had only stopped by to pick up the remainder of her belongings, something he had never mentioned before. This new detail contradicted his earlier statements about helping him with a simple household chore. The inconsistency in his story set off alarms for the investigative team. They had heard enough to believe that Terry knew far more than he was willing to admit. With this new information, the team brought the case back to the district attorney. Prosecutors were now preparing to charge Terry with Kim's murder. The challenge, however, was that the police still lacked direct physical evidence linking him to her death. But they were confident that Terry's inconsistent statements and suspicious behavior would be enough to convince a jury that he was responsible. The discovery of Kim's remains. In a surprising turn of events, just when it seemed the case might again slip through their fingers, a witness came forward with a shocking revelation. This individual, a former employee of Terry's, recalled a chilling conversation he had with Terry years earlier. According to this witness, Terry had once casually mentioned that he had killed his ex-girlfriend and buried her body on his property. The witness didn't take it seriously at the time, but after seeing the documentary, he realized the gravity of the statement. With this new lead, investigators were able to secure a search warrant for Terry's property. They arrived with a team of forensic experts, determined to find evidence that would prove what they had long suspected, that Terry had indeed murdered Kim and buried her somewhere on his property. For days, investigators combed through the grounds, using ground-penetrating radar to search for anomalies in the soil. It wasn't long before they found something, an unusual patch of concrete beneath Terry's bedroom floor. The radar revealed a section of the foundation that appeared to have been tampered with. Pieces of rebar had been cut out of the concrete slab, a clear sign that someone had attempted to hide something beneath it. The team immediately began digging. As the soil was carefully excavated, they uncovered a grim discovery: human remains buried just beneath the concrete. The remains were carefully exhumed and sent to forensic specialists for analysis. The results came back quickly. The remains were identified as Kim Langwell. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. With this discovery, Terry was arrested on charges of murder. He was taken into custody and booked, awaiting trial. The long, agonizing wait for justice had finally come to an end, and Kim's family, who had never given up hope, finally had answers. The haunting truth, the arrest and lingering questions. After 25 long years, the truth had finally come to light. Terry Rose was arrested for the murder of Kim Langwell, his actions now exposed to the world. The discovery of Kim's remains beneath his bedroom floor sealed the case. But even with this revelation, a sense of unease remained. For Kim's family, the arrest did not bring the closure they had hoped for. It was a bittersweet victory, one that carried with it the weight of years spent searching for answers. Kim's family, especially her daughter Tiffany, had spent decades living in the shadows of uncertainty. The pain of losing Kim had never fully healed. Now, with Terry in custody, they were left to confront the deepest questions. Why had he done it? What had driven him to kill Kim? And why had he never shown a flicker of remorse for her death? There was no sense of satisfaction in his capture, just a lingering ache that seemed to grow with each passing day. Tiffany had lived most of her life without her mother, and the emotional toll was clear in her eyes. She had grown into an adult, yet the scars of her childhood without Kim were still raw. She wanted justice, but the thought of seeing Terry in court, facing him as the man who had taken her mother's life, filled her with both anger and an unbearable sorrow. As much as she longed to understand the man who had done this, she knew that nothing would bring Kim back. The mind of a killer. In the weeks following his arrest, Terry's behavior became increasingly unsettling. At first, it seemed as though he had accepted his fate, sitting in his cell with an eerie calm. He spoke little, almost never making eye contact with the officers or his own lawyers. It was as if, after so many years of evading justice, he had retreated into himself, unable or unwilling to confront what he had done. Yet, as the days wore on, Terry began to show signs of psychological strain. He would sit for hours in the same position, his eyes vacant, staring at the walls. Occasionally, he would mutter to himself, as if caught in some internal struggle he couldn't escape. His silence spoke volumes. Was it the burden of guilt, or was it the realization that his secret had been exposed after all these years? The deeper Terry sank into his thoughts, the more it became clear. The truth had started to haunt him. But would he ever admit to it? Would he ever say the words that would bring real closure to Kim's family, words they had been waiting for since her disappearance? It seemed unlikely. He remained stoic, closed off from the world, unwilling to acknowledge the pain he had caused. In his prison cell, Terry's actions and words grew more erratic. His mind seemed to be unraveling, but not in a way that suggested remorse. Rather, it was as though he were facing a war within himself, one that had no clear resolution. He was the man who had taken Kim's life, and now, trapped in the very place he once thought he could escape, he had no way to hide from the truth. The weight of the past. Terry's behavior in jail was perplexing. He was no longer the confident, self-assured man he had once been. Now he was a shadow of his former self, haunted by the actions of his past. The prison walls seemed to close in on him, and for the first time, it seemed as though he was facing the consequences of his crime. Not through the law, but through his own mind. Each day, Terry's thoughts spiraled. He spent hours sitting motionless, his face blank, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Was this guilt, or was it fear? Fear of the trial that loomed ahead, or perhaps something deeper. A fear of the truth finally catching up with him. He had lived for so long with the lie, had convinced himself that he was untouchable. Now, in the cold, quiet confines of his cell, that lie seemed to suffocate him. His family, too, was burdened with the weight of the past. Kim's family had been living in limbo for decades, unable to grieve fully because the answers they sought were always just out of reach. The truth had been hidden for too long, and now that it had finally been uncovered, the emotional cost was immense. Every day without Kim had been a struggle, and now, even though her remains had been found, the pain seemed to deepen. The man who had taken Kim's life showed no remorse, and that fact stung more than anything else. Kim's family and the long road to justice. The arrest had given Kim's family a sense of relief, but it was a relief laced with sorrow. The trial was yet to come, and they knew that it would be an emotional and painful experience. For Tiffany, the idea of facing Terry in court was overwhelming. The man who had caused her so much pain, who had stolen her childhood and her mother, would soon be standing before her. But Tiffany was determined to see it through. She had waited 25 years for justice, and nothing would stop her from ensuring that Terry paid for his crime. Kim's family had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now, as they prepared for the trial, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The pain of Kim's loss was something they would never fully recover from, but the trial would be a step towards some kind of resolution. The fact that Terry had not yet shown any remorse made it clear that the road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road they had to walk. As the trial date approached, the family found themselves reflecting on what had been lost. Kim's absence could never be replaced, but they had to hold on to the hope that, at least, Terry would be held accountable. The next few months would determine the future, not just for Kim's family, but for Terry as well. Would he ever truly pay for what he had done? Would the truth finally come to light in a way that would bring peace to the family Kim had left behind? The countdown to trial. The days dragged on as the countdown to Terry Rose's trial continued. It had been months since his arrest, and the case was finally going to court. For Kim's family, the long wait had been agonizing, filled with mixed emotions. There was relief that Terry would finally be held accountable, but there was also a sense of dread. The trial would bring everything back. The pain of Kim's disappearance, the years spent in the dark, and the deep, irreparable loss they had endured. Tiffany, Kim's daughter, had spent years suppressing the grief that came with the loss of her mother. Now, she was forced to confront it head-on. She knew this trial would be brutal. She would have to face the man who had taken her mother's life. But she also knew that this was the only chance for justice, for closure. Every part of her wanted to scream at Terry, demand to know why he had done it. But Tiffany was determined to remain composed. She was no longer the scared child she had been all those years ago. She was a woman who had fought for this moment, and she would not back down now. The family's resolve was tested as the trial date loomed closer. They had always believed Terry was guilty, but now it would be up to the court to decide. The thought of sitting in the courtroom, staring at the man who had stolen Kim from them, was unbearable. Yet, they knew they had to face him. The truth had to be revealed in full. And for that, they would endure whatever came next. The trial begins. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and family members. Kim's family sat in the front row, their faces tight with anticipation. Terry, seated across from them, remained eerily calm, as if the years of hiding had hardened him beyond recognition. He showed no visible remorse as he stared straight ahead, his gaze never meeting the eyes of Kim's family. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. The evidence against Terry was overwhelming. The discovery of Kim's remains under his bedroom floor, the inconsistencies in his story, and his refusal to cooperate with the police. They painted a vivid picture of a man who had manipulated and controlled Kim for years, and then, when she finally tried to break free, he had taken her life. The evidence, while circumstantial in some places, was enough to make it clear Terry had killed Kim. The defense, on the other hand, argued that there was no solid proof Terry had murdered Kim. They suggested that Kim might have left on her own, or that she had met with someone else after leaving Terry's house. They attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's claims, but it was clear they were struggling. Terry, however, said nothing in his own defense. He sat in silence, never offering an explanation for his actions. As the trial progressed, it became evident that Terry's refusal to speak or show any remorse was becoming his own undoing. The more he remained silent, the more the jury and the public began to question his humanity. How could someone who had taken a life remain so cold? How could someone so devoid of emotion sit in a courtroom after destroying an entire family? Tiffany sat motionless, her hands tightly gripping the edges of her seat. The words of the prosecutor echoed in her mind. Every detail about her mother's death felt like a wound being reopened. She wanted to scream at Terry, to shout that he had no right to remain indifferent, that he should feel the weight of what he had done. But she knew better. She knew the most important thing was for the truth to be heard, no matter how painful. A verdict and a legacy. After weeks of testimony, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated for hours, and finally, the moment arrived. The judge's voice rang out across the silent courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant, Terry Rose, guilty of the murder of Kimberly Langwell. Kim's family let out a collective breath, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. The verdict, though just, did little to ease the pain of losing Kim. The guilty verdict was a step toward justice, but it could never replace the years they had lost without her. Tiffany's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the man who had taken her mother's life would finally be held accountable. Terry's face remained impassive as he was sentenced. No tears. No emotion, just the cold, hard reality of his actions. The sentence was harsh, as it should be, but for Kim's family it was not enough. Nothing could undo the years of trauma and pain Terry had inflicted on them. Nothing could bring Kim back. As Terry was led away, Tiffany felt a strange sense of closure wash over her. It wasn't complete, not by any means, but for the first time in 25 years, she felt that something had been done right. The truth had come to light, and justice had been served. The end of one journey, the beginning of another. The trial was over, but the journey for Kim's family was far from finished. The road to healing would take time. Tiffany knew there would be many more sleepless nights, moments of sadness, and bouts of anger. But she also knew that her mother's spirit had not been silenced. The truth had been told, and the family had fought to ensure that Kim's legacy would live on. As they left the courthouse, Tiffany turned to her family. They had weathered the storm together, and now they would continue to honor Kim's memory. The pain would never fully go away, but at least now they could begin to move forward. For Kim, and for the family that had fought so hard to find her, the journey had been long, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. The road to healing. The courtroom doors had closed, and the weight of the trial was finally behind them. Terry was sentenced, and the family could breathe a little easier, but the battle wasn't over. Healing, Tiffany knew, would be the hardest part of all. The pain of losing Kim had never truly gone away. For years, it had festered in the hearts of Kim's family, an unhealed wound that no amount of justice could fix. Tiffany had lived her whole life without a mother. Now, as an adult, she was left to process not just the trauma of Kim's disappearance, but the realization that the woman she had loved so dearly would never return. In the days and weeks following the verdict, Tiffany found herself surrounded by her family. They were all trying to rebuild the pieces of their lives, trying to fill the void that Kim had left. But the absence of her mother was something that could never be replaced. Tiffany still caught herself reaching for her phone to call Kim, to hear her voice, to share a small victory, a funny story, or just to ask for advice. It was in those quiet moments that the weight of her loss hit the hardest. But despite the grief, Tiffany began to feel a flicker of hope. With the conviction of Terry Rose, she realized that justice had been done. For the first time in decades, she could say the words that had eluded her for so long. My mother's killer was caught. That alone gave her a sense of peace, even if it wasn't enough to heal the pain completely. In the months that followed, Tiffany dedicated herself to keeping Kim's memory alive. She spoke about her mother to anyone who would listen, sharing stories of Kim's warmth, strength, and the love she had for her family. Tiffany began to focus on building a future that Kim would have been proud of, one where she would honor her mother's legacy and ensure that Kim's life had meaning, even in death. A legacy of love. As Tiffany continued her journey of healing, she realized that it wasn't just about the past, it was also about the future. She took up causes that Kim had cared about deeply. She became involved in local charities, particularly those that supported single mothers, and worked to raise awareness about domestic violence, something Kim had quietly suffered from during her relationship with Terry. In every corner of her life, Tiffany began to see her mother's influence. Kim had always been someone who fought for the underdog, someone who didn't give up, no matter how hard life became. Tiffany knew she wanted to carry that spirit with her, to continue the fight her mother had started, even if Kim hadn't lived to see the end of it. Tiffany's work was not easy, and there were days when the grief felt overwhelming. But with each day, she grew stronger. The love Kim had shown her, even in the hardest of times, was something that could never be taken away. Tiffany began to understand that, while she could never replace the hole left in her heart, she could build something meaningful out of her pain. She could turn her grief into action, into something that would honor her mother's memory. Reflections on justice. For Kim's family, the journey to justice had been long, grueling, and filled with setbacks. There had been moments when they felt ready to give up, when they thought they would never see the man responsible for Kim's death held accountable. But now, looking back, they realized that their fight had not been in vain. Justice, while important, wasn't just about punishment, it was about the truth. It was about ensuring that Kim's story was told, that her life and her death were not forgotten. And in the end, they had achieved that. The truth had come to light, and Terry had been convicted. The weight of that truth was heavy, but it also set them free in a way they hadn't imagined possible. Tiffany and her family could now begin to rebuild their lives, to find a new normal, one that would never forget Kim, but that would also allow them to move forward. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. A new chapter begins. Kim's legacy lived on in the work that Tiffany did, in the lives she touched, and in the memories of those who had known her. But it also lived on in Tiffany's ability to move forward, to heal, and to live a life that her mother would have been proud of. As Tiffany stood at her mother's grave, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The trial had been painful, but it had brought closure. The journey to justice had been long, but it had finally come to an end. Now it was time to look ahead. Kim would always be with her. Tiffany knew that now. In every step she took, in every choice she made, her mother's spirit would guide her. The love Kim had given her, the lessons she had taught her, would live on forever. Tiffany smiled softly, knowing that her mother's legacy was not just about what had happened in the past. It was about the future they could still shape, the lives they could still touch, and the love that would always endure. The road to healing. The courtroom doors had closed, and the weight of the trial was finally behind them. Terry was sentenced, and while Kim's family felt a brief sense of justice, it was far from the end of their journey. The emotional toll of the past years, of waiting, of hoping, and of grieving, was far from over. Tiffany, now an adult, had spent most of her life without her mother. The trial had given her the answers she needed, but it hadn't healed the pain. Kim's absence was something that would never be filled. In the days following the trial, Tiffany found herself wrestling with the overwhelming flood of emotions that had been building up inside her. The relief of justice had brought some peace, but it also uncovered wounds that had never truly healed. For Tiffany, the trial had been an emotional roller coaster. In the courtroom, she had held herself together, focused on the pursuit of justice. But when the trial ended, she realized that the real work, healing, had only just begun. Every part of her longed to reach out to her mother, to hear her voice, to have the chance to share with Kim everything that had happened. But it was too late. The pain of not having Kim around felt suffocating at times. Tiffany wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, to ask why her mother had been taken from her. But in those moments, she remembered her mother's strength, her resilience, and the love Kim had always given her. It was that love that Tiffany chose to focus on, using it as a light to guide her through the darkest moments. As the weeks turned into months, Tiffany threw herself into work that mattered to her, causes she knew her mother had been passionate about. She became involved in helping other children of single parents, volunteering at local shelters, and speaking out against domestic violence. She found a sense of purpose in honoring Kim's legacy. There were still moments of deep sadness, moments when the grief seemed unbearable. But with each passing day, Tiffany grew stronger. The journey of healing would take time, but she was no longer alone in it. Her family surrounded her, offering support, love, and encouragement. Together, they began to rebuild, to move forward. The months after the trial brought Tiffany a sense of clarity. Kim's death, while leaving an irreparable hole in her life, had also given her a purpose, a cause to fight for. Tiffany understood that, though Kim was gone, her spirit could still shape the world through the love she had shown, the lessons she had imparted, and the strength she had passed down. Tiffany started speaking more openly about Kim, sharing her mother's story with anyone who would listen. She spoke about the woman who had raised her alone, who had worked tirelessly to give her the best life possible, even though life had thrown so many obstacles in her way. Kim had been a fighter, someone who never backed down from adversity, and Tiffany carried that same spirit with her. She dedicated herself to preserving Kim's memory and ensuring that others knew what kind of woman Kim had been. Tiffany's involvement in charity work continued to grow, as she became more passionate about helping others who were going through similar struggles. She advocated for single mothers, offered counseling to women who had been in abusive relationships, and raised funds for organizations supporting domestic violence survivors. It was her way of giving back, of continuing the work Kim had done while she was alive. There were moments when Tiffany still struggled, when the weight of missing her mother felt too heavy to bear. But she knew that Kim's love was still with her, guiding her forward. She began to see that her mother's legacy wasn't just about the past. It was about what she could do with the present and the future. With each step forward, Tiffany found herself becoming more at peace with the past. She still grieved for the loss of Kim, but she no longer let it define her. She had learned to carry Kim's love with her, to allow it to empower her to do good in the world, to make a difference. Through the work she did and the love she shared with others, Kim's memory lived on. The road to healing was still ongoing, but Tiffany knew now that she could face it, no matter how long it took. Kim's legacy was not just about what had happened, but about what Tiffany would do next. How she would continue to honor her mother's memory through her actions, her strength, and her love for others. Kim may have been gone, but she would never be forgotten. Rusty's reflection. As I stand here, looking at the events that have unfolded in this case, I can't help but reflect on the journey that Kim Langwell's family has endured. The road to justice has never been easy, and it's a path that too many families must walk. The truth is often hidden in the most unlikely of places, and sometimes it takes years, decades even, for it to surface. In this case, it was a long and painful wait, one filled with uncertainty and unanswered questions. But despite the years of darkness, the Langwell family persevered. They fought for the truth, and they never gave up on the hope that justice would one day be served. And in the end, they got what they deserved, the truth. But what stands out to me in this case is not just the conviction of Terry Rose. It's the resilience of Kim's family, especially Tiffany. She lived for years without knowing the full story of what happened to her mother. She was forced to grow up in the shadow of that loss, but she never lost her sense of who she was or who her mother was. Tiffany's journey has been one of both grief and strength. It's a reminder to all of us that even in the darkest times, there is hope. Even in the face of unspeakable pain, there is a way to move forward. What matters most is what we do with the time we have left, how we choose to honor the memory of those we've lost, and how we use that pain to fuel something greater. Kim Langwell's legacy lives on in Tiffany, in her family, and in the countless lives she touched, even in her absence. And while Terry Rose may have been convicted, the real victory here is the strength of a family that refused to let their loved one be forgotten. As we close the chapter on Kim Langwell's case, I want to take a moment to thank all of you for following this journey. The pursuit of justice is never an easy path, but it's one worth taking, especially when we come together to seek the truth. Kim's family fought for years, and now, through their strength and perseverance, we've witnessed how justice can prevail, even when it seems impossible. If you found this story as compelling as I have, I encourage you to subscribe to Truth and Shadow and join us as we continue to explore real-life cases like Kim's, where truth and justice are often hidden beneath layers of pain and mystery. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear the untold stories, dive deeper into the minds of the people involved, and witness how ordinary people fight extraordinary battles in the name of justice. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us. Your support means more than words can express, and I hope you'll continue to walk with us through the shadows, seeking the truth in every story we tell. Thank you all for watching and for supporting this channel. Your passion for uncovering the truth is what drives us to keep going. Without your engagement, these stories wouldn't have the impact they do. I'm proud to have had you with me on this one. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking the truth.